Welcome back. I need to tell you something I have never told anyone before. This is about the Dwemer, but it is not about where they went. It is about what would have happened if they never left. If Kagrenac succeeded at the Battle of Red Mountain, if the Heart of Lorkhan beat to their rhythm instead of silencing them forever. I have been to that world. I have walked through Blackreach while the lights still burned with purpose. I have seen the Dwemer Renaissance, and I am here to tell you that their disappearance was mercy. What I witnessed in that timeline, where they thrived, was more terrible than any vanishing could ever be. They tried to become gods, and succeeded only in becoming machines, and in doing so, they created Tamriel's true nightmare, a world perfected into silence. This is my confession. This is my warning. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if it truly resonates with you. I descend into Blackreach, and it is not the ruin you know. The lights do not flicker with the memory of purpose. They burn with intention. The mushrooms glow not as remnants of a forgotten ecosystem, but as cultivated gardens, tended by hands that understand the precise chemistry of luminescence. The brass mechanisms do not stand silent. They hum, they breathe, they walk among their creators. I am tolerated here, not welcomed. The Dwemer do not smile when I pass through their checkpoints, do not nod in greeting. They measure me with amber eyes behind those goggles, those cursed goggles that hide what they have traded away. They calculate my usefulness, my threat level, my potential as data. In this world, the deep folk did not vanish in 1E700. In this world, Kagrenac succeeded. Let me tell you what success looks like. The Heart of Lorkhan beat to their rhythm on that day beneath Red Mountain. Not the rhythm of the gods, but the rhythm of mathematics, of tonal architecture rendered perfect through centuries of study. When Nerevar and his companions broke through to that chamber, when Kagrenac raised sunder high above the crystalline muscle of divinity itself, the sound that followed was not thunder. It was a chord, perfect, mechanical, cold. The chimer watched as Kagrenac struck the heart, and they waited for catastrophe, for divine retribution, for the world to unmake itself. Instead, they witnessed efficiency. The heart's power flowed through channels the Dwemer had prepared, into conduits of brass and geometries that bent space itself into that towering construct they called Numidium. The brass god opened its eyes, not with consciousness, but with function. I have stood before Numidium in this timeline. It rests in the deepest chamber of Blackreach now, 1,000 feet of brass and blasphemy, dormant but not dead, successful proof of concept. The Dwemer proved their theory that day. Gods could be made. Divinity could be calculated. The Aedra were not special. They were simply data that had not yet been properly analyzed. Victory on the battlefield came swiftly after that. The Chimer forces, even with Nerevar's cunning and the Proto-Tribunal's power, could not stand against the full might of Dwemery war machinery, backed by the Heart's limitless energy. The Battle of Red Mountain did not end with mysterious disappearance. It ended with defeat. The Chimer were driven from Vardenfell, scattered across Morrowind's ashlands, and the Dwemer claimed their prize absolutely. But this is not a story about military victory. This is a confession about what was lost in that success. The Falmer served them still. Do you understand what I mean by still? In your timeline, the Snow Elves were blinded and enslaved, twisted into something less than themselves over generations of toxic fungi and cruelty. In my timeline, the same beginning occurred, but the Dwemer refined their methods, perfected them. The blinding was not accident or necessity, it was design. I have walked through the Falmer breeding facilities in the lower levels of Blackreach. I have seen the feeding schedules carved in stone, the precise mixtures of fungi cultivated not just to blind but to shape. The Dwemer did not want workers who might rebel. They wanted workers who could not conceive of rebellion. So they bred it out over generations, alongside sight, alongside pride, alongside anything that might be called will. The Falmer in this world are smaller than you might imagine, paler. They move with the precision of trained dogs, responding to tonal commands the Dwemer broadcast through crystal amplifiers. They maintain the deep tunnels, harvest the mushroom farms, operate the pumps that keep the underground cities dry. They do this without complaint, without thought, without memory of what their ancestors once were. Sometimes I catch one staring in my direction with its empty eye sockets, and I wonder if some fragment of ancient knowledge persists in whatever passes for their minds. Then a Dwemer overseer sounds a crystal chime, and the Falmer returns to its task, and I remember there is nothing left to save. The Dwemer called it practical, they called it efficient, they called it necessary for their civilization's continued expansion. What they did not call it was what it was. They created a race of living tools, as much Dwemery artifice as any centurion or sphere, more reliable, in some ways, organic mechanisms that could self-repair, that required only simple food and simple commands. If you think this makes the Dwemer monsters, you are not entirely wrong, but you do not yet understand the full cost of their success. Blackreach expanded. In your timeline, it is one vast cavern connecting 3 Dwemer cities, spectacular in its abandonment. In my timeline, Blackreach is the heart of an empire that spreads like mycelium beneath all of Tamriel. From Skyrim to Morrowind to Hammerfell, the Dwemer burrowed deep and built deeper. Their cities connect through tunnels that make borders meaningless, that render surface politics irrelevant. I have traveled those tunnels, weeks of walking through corridors lit by bioluminescent cultivation, past Falmer work crews and autonomous machines following the rhythmic pulse of distant pumps. You emerge in Hammerfell, having never seen the sun. You ascend through a great lift into Markarth, and you realize the surface city is little more than a decorative shell around the true metropolis below. The surface races learned to need the Dwemer. This was perhaps Kagrenac's greatest achievement, though I doubt he lived to see its full fruition. The Dwemer did not conquer through war after Red Mountain. They conquered through indispensability. They sold their automatons to keep the peace in surface cities. They leased their technology to make harvests more efficient. They offered solutions to problems the surface dwellers did not know they had until Dwemerite merchants explained them. Within 2 centuries, you could not walk through any major city in Tamriel without seeing Dwemer influence. Waterworks, heating systems, security spheres patrolling the streets. The College of Winterhold's entire structure reinforced with Dwemery engineering after a wing collapsed. The Imperial City's sewers redesigned according to Dwemery efficiency models. Even Valenwood's tree cities incorporated Dwemer technology, though they hated themselves for it. Magic did not die in this timeline, but it withered. Why spend decades mastering destruction magic when a Dwemer shock rod does the same work with a trigger pull? Why study alteration when Dwemer elevators can lift you anywhere you need to go? Why pursue mysticism when Dwemer communication crystals can send messages across the continent? The old ways became the province of holdouts and traditionalists. The Nords still had their graybeards, still trained the occasional tongue, but fewer came each generation. The College of Winterhold still taught the arcane arts, but their graduates found few opportunities beyond research positions, funded by Dwemery corporations, studying magic as a resource to be exploited. I have spoken with the last traditional mages, the ones who refused Dwemer assistance. They are bitter people, watching their craft become obsolete. A destruction mage who spent 40 years mastering fire cannot compete with a Dwemer flamethrower. An illusion mage's carefully constructed phantasms are useless against automatons that see with crystal optics, analyzing wavelengths beyond human perception. But the surface dwellers accepted this. They grew comfortable with their dependence. Life became easier, safer, longer. Dwemer medicine reduced child mortality. Dwemer sanitation eliminated plagues. Dwemer construction made homes that did not leak or rot. Who would reject such gifts? Who would choose hardship over convenience? Only those who saw the price, and we were few. Let me tell you about the Dwemer themselves, because this is where the confession turns dark. This is where I must tell you what I have seen in their eyes, behind those amber goggles they never remove. The goggles are not decoration, they are necessity. The The Dwemer damaged their eyes in their work with the Heart of Lorkhan, with Numidium, with the tonal frequencies they use to reshape reality at its fundamental level. The amber lenses filter out the wavelengths that would drive them mad, that would show them truths no mortal mind should perceive. Every Dwemer artificer above a certain rank wears them, every tonal architect requires them. To work at the highest levels of Dwemerai science is to accept blindness to the normal spectrum of light. In exchange for sight into deeper patterns, they traded their ability to see sunlight for the ability to see the underlying mathematics of existence. They consider it an acceptable exchange. I watched a Dwemer child receive their first goggles in a coming-of-age ceremony in the halls of unsolved. The child was 12 years old. The ritual was efficient, practical, devoid of the emotional weight such a transformation should carry. The artificer who performed the procedure explained the benefits in a tone one might use to describe a new kind of wrench: enhanced perception, greater understanding, access to tonal frequencies invisible to unaugmented eyes. The child nodded and accepted the goggles, and when they looked up at their parents, there was something already missing in their expression. Some warmth, some connection to the things that make us mortal. They had taken the first step toward what the Dwemer consider enlightenment, and what I recognize as something far more troubling. The Dwemer did not disappear in this timeline, but they are vanishing nonetheless, slowly, by degrees, into their own success. They do not laugh anymore. Dwemer humor exists, but it is dry, analytical, concerned with the absurdity of logical contradictions rather than the absurdity of life. They do not create art beyond what serves function. Their music is tonal architecture, beautiful perhaps, but beautiful the way a mathematical proof is beautiful, cold, perfect, inhuman. They do not love, not as we understand love. They form partnerships based on compatible skill sets. They reproduce not out of passion, but out of calculated continuation of genetic lines. I have never seen a Dwemer couple hold hands. I have never seen a Dwemer parent embrace their child except in the moment of danger, and even then it is mechanical, protective instinct without emotional resonance. They are becoming their machines. Or perhaps their machines are revealing what they always wanted to be. What do you think really happened here? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I would like to know if I am the only one who feels this way. I have been in this timeline for 7 years now. 7 years since the accident at the College of Winterhold, since the experiment that should have killed me, but instead displaced me into this sideways world, where history bent different. 7 years of living among the consequences of Dwemer's success. The underground cities are marvels. I will give them that. Blackreach alone would be worth a lifetime of study in your timeline. Here it is, simply the first of many. There are places beneath Skyrim where the Dwemer have built cathedrals to geometry, vast spaces where brass towers rise toward stone ceilings carved with formulas, where the air thrums with tonal frequencies that make your teeth ache if you listen too long. The deep folk walk these streets with purpose, every action optimized, every moment of their lives scheduled with ruthless efficiency. They have eliminated waste. They have maximized productivity. They have removed inefficiency from their culture so thoroughly that they have removed humanity along with it. And the surface dwellers trade with them, depend on them, envy them even. The Nords look at Dwemer, longevity and physical enhancement, and wish they could afford the procedures. The Bretons study Dwemery education methods and implement them in their own schools. The Imperials restructure their bureaucracy according to Dwemery efficiency models. Tamriel is slowly becoming Dwemer, not through conquest, but through seduction. The deep folk offer solutions, and who can blame the surface for accepting them? Who would choose short lives and hard labor when Dwemery medicine and machinery offer alternatives? But I have seen the end of this path. I have been deep enough into Dwemer society to see where their logic leads. They pursue perfection, and perfection is static. They seek to eliminate variables, and life is nothing but variables. They work toward a future where everything can be predicted, calculated, and controlled. They are building a world where nothing can surprise them, and surprise is what makes us alive. I spoke with a Dwemer philosopher in the archives of Nchardak, one of the few who still engage with traditional modes of thought, who still questions rather than merely calculates. She was old, ancient even by Dwemery standards, her goggles so worn the brass had developed a patina. She asked me why I seemed troubled by their achievements. I told her I feared they were making themselves extinct while still breathing. She considered this for a long moment, and then she said something that haunts me still. She said the Dwemer knew this. They had always known. Their philosophers predicted it when they first began down this path. The pursuit of perfect understanding leads inevitably to the elimination of the self, because the self is imperfect, emotional, irrational. The Dwemer collective chose this path with open eyes. They decided that existence without mystery, without chaos, without the divine, was preferable to existence haunted by uncertainty. They chose to make themselves into machines because machines do not doubt. Machines do not fear. Machines do not wonder about their purpose because their purpose is their function. I asked her if she believed this was right. She adjusted her goggles and returned to her work without answering. The war with the Chimer continued for decades after Red Mountain, though it was less a war than a grinding absorption. The Dwemer pushed east slowly, methodically, establishing underground routes beneath Morrowind, surfacing to claim strategic points, building their great lifts in the ruins of Chimer settlements. The Chimer resisted, fought with the fury of the displaced, but they could not match Dwemer resources, Dwemer coordination, Dwemer machinery that did not tire or feel pain or question orders. Nerevar died in those wars, though accounts differ on how. Some say in battle against a Dwemer Centurion battalion at Kragenmoor. Some say assassinated by his own counselors who wanted to negotiate peace rather than continue hopeless resistance. Some say he walked into the deep places, seeking a way to Muflag to speak with Azura directly, and never returned. His companions, those who would have become the tribunal in your timeline, scattered. Vivek disappeared into the Ashlands and was not seen again. Almalexia led resistance cells for another decade before she was captured and, according to Dwemer records, offered a choice: accept their dominion or die. She chose death, and they honored that choice with efficient execution. Sotha Sil alone adapted. He studied Dwemer methods, learned their language, eventually was permitted access to their libraries in exchange for sharing Chimer magical knowledge. I have read Sotha Sil's later writings. He became obsessed with the idea of creating his own realm, a place where he could apply Dwemery principles to divine power itself, where he could build a god not of brass, but of clockwork. The Dwemer gave him resources, curious to see what a mortal mage with access to their technology might achieve. He built his clockwork city somewhere in the plains of Oblivion, and when last anyone heard from him, he had sealed himself inside with his creations, working on some great project he would not explain. Perhaps he thought he could out-Dwemer the Dwemer. Perhaps he thought he could show them a better path. Perhaps he simply went mad. I do not know. But I think about him often, about whether his fate is just another expression of what happens when mortals try to perfect themselves out of mortality. The Falmer do not remember any of this. The Falmer do not remember anything. They exist in an eternal present, responding to commands, performing tasks, breeding the next generation of perfect servants. The Dwemer keep them healthy enough, feed them enough, house them in clean facilities with adequate sleeping quarters. By any technical measure, the Falmer are well cared for. But I have watched a Falmer mother give birth and show no recognition when they hand her the infant. I have watched young Falmer reach out to touch each other and then pull away as if remembering touch is forbidden. I have watched the entire species exist in a state of living death, neither suffering enough to die nor alive enough to be called living. The Dwemer say they saved the Falmer from extinction. They say they offered the Snow Elves shelter when the Nords hunted them to near elimination. They say everything that came after was necessary adjustment, practical accommodation to the realities of cohabitation between two species with incompatible values. They do not lie when they say this. The Dwemer do not lie. Lies are inefficient. They simply do not acknowledge that mercy without compassion is just another form of cruelty. I think about the Snow Prince sometimes. In your timeline, he died at the Battle of the Mosring, killed by a girl who threw her mother's sword through his heart. In my timeline, the battle happened differently. The Dwemer intervened before the final confrontation, offering the Falmer an alternative to hopeless last stands. The Snow Prince accepted their offer, led his people into the deep places, and watched as the Dwemer kept their promises of safety, while slowly, methodically, kindly destroyed everything that made the Snow Elves themselves. I wonder if he is still alive down there somewhere, kept preserved by Dwemer medicine, watching his people shamble past in endless servitude. I wonder if they left him his eyes deliberately, so he could see what his choice bought them. I wonder if he regrets his decision, or if the Dwemer long ago convinced him that this was always the only logical outcome. I wonder these things, but I do not seek answers, because I fear what I might find. The surface world adapted to Dwemer dominance the way water adapts to a new channel. Resistance flows elsewhere, or it evaporates. I have walked through Windhelm in this timeline, that city the Nords built with Falmer slave labor in both our worlds. Here, the difference is architectural. The original construction remains, those ancient stones placed by blind hands under Nordic whips, but running through the old walls like copper veins through granite, are Dwemeri installation, heating systems that keep the city warm even in the depths of winter. Lift systems connecting the lower districts to the upper. Security automatons standing at every corner, their crystal eyes tracking movement, calculating threat levels, broadcasting reports to some central Dwemer facility deep below the city. The Nords do not seem to mind. They have grown comfortable with the comfort. I spoke with an old Nord woman in Candlehearth Hall, one of the few establishments that still refuses Dwemer modifications. She remembered when Windhelm had no machines, when the city relied on its own strength, its own ingenuity. She remembered when Nords did not need deep folk permission to modify their own buildings, when they did not pay licensing fees to use Dwemer plumbing, when their children did not learn Dwemerus before they all learned their own history. She was drunk when she told me this, and, alone, her children work in the Dwemer facilities below the city. Her grandchildren attend Dwemeri-designed schools, where efficiency is valued above tradition, where knowledge is measured in applicable skills rather than cultural understanding. She is the last of something in her family, and she knows it. When she finished talking, she looked at me with eyes that had seen too much change, and she asked a question I could not answer. She asked if I thought it was better to die free or live comfortable. She asked if her ancestors would be ashamed of what the Nords had become. She asked if surrender could be so gradual, so gentle, that you did not realize you had given up until there was nothing left to give. I bought her another drink and left without answering, because the answer would have broken her, and she was already breaking. The companions still exist in this timeline, though they are shadow of what they were. They do not fight giants or clear out bandit camps. There are no bandits, not anymore. The Dwemer security grid tracks all unauthorized movement across their claimed territories. Automatons respond to disturbances with ruthless efficiency. Crime still exists, but it is corporate now, bureaucratic, conducted through proper channels with proper licensing. The companions have become a historical society. They maintain Jorvaskr, tell the old stories, perform demonstrations of ancient Nordic combat techniques for tourists. Some of them hire themselves out as guards for surface caravans that refuse Dwemer protection, though there are fewer of those each year. Mostly they drink and remember when being a warrior meant something beyond being decorative. I watched them train in their yard one morning. The motions were correct, technically precise, learned from generations of teaching, but there was something hollow in the practice. They were maintaining forms without believing in their purpose. They swung their weapons at straw dummies while Dwemer's security spheres hummed past overhead, and no one acknowledged the absurdity. One of them, a young woman barely 20, caught me watching. She approached with the eagerness of someone desperate to prove their relevance. She asked if I needed protection, if I required escort through dangerous territory, if there was something she could fight. I told her I was traveling to Blackreach. Her face fell. Everyone knows you do not need protection in Blackreach. The Dwemer cities are the safest places in Tamriel. Crime is statistically insignificant. Accidents are rare. Death itself is becoming optional for those who can afford Dwemer life extension procedures. You are safer in the deep places than anywhere on the surface. She turned away without another word, and I felt like I had killed something in her. The Thieves Guild does not exist in this timeline. I asked about them once in Riften, and the people looked at me, confused. Theft is nearly impossible in a world where everything is tracked, cataloged, monitored by systems that do not sleep or take bribes. The Ratway still exists, but it is cleaner now, maintained by Dwemer sanitation automatons. The poor still live there, but they live there efficiently, in modular housing units designed for maximum space utilization. Maven Blackbriar runs a successful meadery. She pays her taxes, she follows regulations. She is, by all accounts, a model citizen. I met her once, and for just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that suggested she remembered other possibilities, other paths her life might have taken. Then she smiled, offered me a drink, and talked about her latest contract with the Dwemer brewing collectives. The Dark Brotherhood is gone entirely. The Dwemer found their sanctuaries within a decade of Red Mountain, not through investigation, but through systematic mapping of every cave system in Skyrim. The Brotherhood tried to hide in remote places, but there are no remote places anymore. Dwemer survey teams had cataloged every space large enough to house a person. They sealed the sanctuaries, not violently, simply efficiently. Stone and steel welded shut by tonal architecture that could not be picked or battered down. Some of the Brotherhood escaped, fled to other provinces, tried to maintain their traditions. But assassination is difficult in a world where everyone is monitored, where deaths are immediately investigated by automatons immune to bribes or intimidation, where the Dwemer track cause of death with scientific precision. The Night Mother's corpse was discovered in a sealed cave in Skyrim 2 years ago. The Dwemer examined it, classified it as an artifact of historical interest, and placed it in a museum. You can view it now in the Hall of Cultural Preservation in Blackreach, properly labeled and climate-controlled. Visitors walk past it without understanding what it represents, what it meant to the people who once worshipped in darkness. I stood before that corpse for an hour, and I swear I heard whispering, but it might have been the ventilation system. The Dwemer are very thorough about air circulation. The Daedric princes have not vanished in this timeline, but they have diminished. Their spheres of influence contract when worship declines, and worship has declined precipitously. Why pray to Mehrunes Dagon for change when you can submit a proposal to the Dwemer Development Board? Why seek Hermaeus Mora for knowledge when the Dwemer databases contain more information than any mortal could absorb in 10 lifetimes? The Daedric shrines still stand, but they are maintained as cultural sites, not religious ones. I visited the shrine of Azura, that statue overlooking Winterhold, expecting to find it abandoned or destroyed. Instead, I found it beautifully preserved, recently cleaned, with informational plaques explaining its historical significance to Chimer culture. A Dwemer archaeologist was there, studying the statue with instruments that measured magical resonance. She explained to me that Daedric artifacts show fascinating energy patterns, that the Dwemer are very interested in understanding how metaphysical entities maintain coherence across planes. She spoke about Azura the way you might speak about an interesting chemical reaction. I asked her if she believed Azura was real. She looked at me as if I had asked whether mathematics was real. She said belief was irrelevant. Measurement determined existence. The entity registered on their instruments, therefore it existed in some capacity. Whether that existence matched traditional theological descriptions was a separate question requiring further study. I asked if she thought Azura minded being studied like a specimen. She adjusted her goggles and returned to her measurements without answering. I was learning that non-answers were the Dwemer way of saying the question was irrelevant, but the Daedric princes do mind. I know this because I have felt their attention on this world. Frustrated and impotent, they thrive on mortal worship, mortal fear, mortal desire. The Dwemer offer them none of these things. The Dwemer are not afraid of damnation because they do not believe in souls as anything beyond electrical patterns in organic brains. They do not desire power because they have optimized their society to provide everything they need. They do not worship because worship implies subordination to something greater, and the Dwemer recognize nothing as greater than their collective understanding. The princes still have their artifacts scattered across the world: Mehrunes razor, the mace of Molag Bal, the Wabajak. The Dwemer have cataloged most of them, studied them, replicated some of their effects through purely mechanical means. You can visit the Chamber of Daedric Analogues in Shuan Zel and see Dwemer-made weapons that produce effects nearly identical to Daedric artifacts, powered not by souls or divine essence, but by Ethereum cores and tonal manipulation. Nearly identical, but not quite. There is something missing in the Dwemer copies, some quality that defies their measurements. It frustrates them. They keep studying, keep refining, convinced that, with enough data, they will understand what makes a Daedric artifact truly Daedric. They do not seem to consider that the missing quality might be the one thing they have systematically eliminated from their own existence: chaos, mystery, the irrational spark of something that cannot be calculated. Sheogorath visited me once. I was in a Dwemer library in Bethardams, reading accounts of the Red Mountain battle from their clinical perspective, when a scholar approached my table. He sat down across from me, smiled too widely, and his eyes were wrong behind his amber goggles. Wrong in a way that suggested the goggles were seeing something the Dwemer never intended them to see. He spoke in a voice that sometimes sounded like one person and sometimes like a chorus. He said he found this timeline absolutely delicious. He said watching the Dwemer succeed was the funniest joke he had witnessed in several eras. He said they had worked so hard to eliminate madness from their society, to make everything rational and predictable, that they had driven themselves collectively insane in the process. I asked him what he meant. He leaned forward, and his smile grew wider, and he said, "They cannot see it, but everyone else can. The Dwemer think they have found perfect logic, but really they have just found a very particular kind of madness. The madness of believing rationality is the only truth. The madness of thinking you can calculate your way out of being mortal. They have become their own perfect joke, and the punchline is that they will never understand why everyone else is uncomfortable around them." Then he stood, tipped a hat he was not wearing, and walked away. The scholar he had been inhabiting stopped mid-stride, looked around confused, and returned to his work as if nothing had happened. But I noticed him scratching his arms for the rest of the day, as if trying to remove the feeling of having been worn by something else. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from Skyrim, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these. The College of Winterhold exists, but it is funded almost entirely by Dwemer research grants. They study magic as the Dwemer want it studied, as a force to be understood mechanically, as energy to be harnessed and optimized. The old mysticism, the belief that magic was art as much as science, has been systematically deprecated. Students who show too much creativity, who approach magic with intuition rather than calculation, are gently encouraged to pursue other fields. I attended a lecture there on the modern understanding of destruction magic. The instructor explained how fire spells could be optimized by understanding combustion chemistry, how frost magic efficiency increased through precise targeting of molecular motion, how shock spells were simply directed electrical discharge that could be improved through better understanding of conductivity and resistance. She was not wrong. Her approach produced measurable improvements in spell efficiency, but watching her explain it, I felt something die inside me. She was turning the most primal, most human expression of will made manifest into engineering. She was making magic boring. A student asked about the feeling of casting, about the connection between caster and spell. The instructor looked confused. She said There was no evidence that emotional state significantly affected spell output once proper technique was established. She said feelings were subjective experiences that could not be reliably measured and therefore should not be part of serious magical study. The student did not ask another question. I have watched the light go out of mages in this timeline, one by one, as they realize their art is being transformed into something else. Some adapt, become magical engineers, and find satisfaction in optimization. Others quit, return to farming or crafting or other pursuits where passion still has space to exist. A few continue practicing the old ways in private, hiding their belief that magic is more than mechanics, the way people in oppressive regimes hide their faith. The Archmage is a Dwemer now, the first Dwemer ever admitted to the position. She is brilliant, capable, efficient. She has improved the college's safety records significantly. Students learn faster under her curriculum. Graduation rates have never been higher. The college produces more qualified mages per year than at any point in its history, but they are all the same kind of mage, precise, careful, afraid to experiment beyond approved parameters. They know their formulas, their optimal casting techniques, their safety protocols. They do not know wonder. They do not know the terror and joy of touching something greater than themselves. They do not know what it feels like to cast a spell that surprises you. The dragons remain imprisoned in time. Alduin has not returned in this timeline, and I have spent years trying to understand why. The prophecy speaks of the World-Eater returning when the brass tower walks and time is reshaped. But in this timeline, the brass tower has walked. Numidium proved its function at Red Mountain. Time itself bent around its activation, though not in the catastrophic way it did in your timeline during the warp in the west. So why has Alduin not returned? I found a Dwemer chronological studies specialist who was willing to discuss the question. She explained that their measurements suggested the temporal distortion from Numidium's activation was significant, but localized. The Dwemer had been very careful in their calculations. They had used the heart's power precisely, avoiding the reality-breaking cascade that uncontrolled usage might trigger. In effect, they had used a god's heart to power a god's body without waking the world-eating god who was supposed to respond to such blasphemy. They had committed the ultimate transgression so carefully, so precisely, that reality did not notice. I asked her if she thought this was wise. She said wisdom was irrelevant. They had achieved their objective. Numidium functioned. The Dwemer persisted. By any measurable metric, they had succeeded. I asked her if she ever considered that some prices are paid later rather than never. She adjusted her goggles and changed the subject. But I think about Alduin. I think about a dragon older than time, an entity whose purpose is to end and begin the world, who has not awakened because the Dwemer managed to commit their sin so efficiently that even divine retribution could not find purchase. I think about what it means when you are so perfectly wrong that even the mechanisms meant to correct you cannot engage. And I wonder if this is not, in some way, worse than if they had failed catastrophically. At least, catastrophic failure brings ending. This is perpetual error, sustained indefinitely through careful maintenance. The Dwemer are masters of maintenance. I have descended into the deepest parts of Blackreach, past the tourist areas, past the residential zones, past even the industrial sectors where Falmer work under crystal light supervision. There are places the Dwemer do not speak about, chambers they do not show to outsiders. I should not have seen them, but 7 years of living in this timeline has taught me how to move quietly, how to find the gaps in their surveillance, how to exist in the spaces between their perfect systems. Down there, in the deepest places, they are still working on something, an expansion of Numidium, or perhaps an improvement. I saw schematics I could not fully understand, formulas written in mathematical notation so advanced it looked like art. I saw chambers the size of cities being excavated, prepared for some vast project. I saw Dwemer working with an intensity I had not seen before, with something that almost looked like urgency. The deep folk are never urgent. Urgency implies that time matters, that something might be lost if action is not taken quickly. The Dwemer have eliminated urgency through planning, but here, in the deepest places, they were urgent. I watched them for 3 days before I was discovered. A security automaton found me, scanned me, and I waited for the alarm. Instead, a Dwemer architect approached. She did not ask what I was doing there. She looked at me with those inscrutable amber lenses, and she said something I will never forget. She said, "You are from a different timeline. We have known for some time. We have been monitoring your displacement signature since you arrived. We allowed you to observe because we wanted to see what conclusions you would reach." I asked her what they were building. She said, "Completion." I asked what that meant. She said, "The Dwemer project has always been to transcend mortal limitations. We eliminated disease. We eliminated short lifespans. We eliminated inefficiency and irrationality. But we remain bound to Mundus, to physical existence, to the dream. The final step is to eliminate that binding, to make ourselves truly independent of the forces that shaped us." I asked if that meant they intended to leave reality. She said, "We intend to improve it, to remake it according to proper principles. The Orbis is flawed, chaotic, subject to the whims of entities that should not have power over those who understand more than they do. We will correct this." I asked when. She said, "When we are ready, when our calculations are complete, when we have eliminated the last variables. Soon. If you have ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, tell me in the comments. I will be reading them." She escorted me back to the surface levels then. Not roughly, not with threat, but with the gentle firmness of someone removing a child from a dangerous room. She explained that I was welcome in the public areas of Blackreach, that I should feel free to continue my observations, but that certain projects required isolation from outside influence. She did not need to explain what would happen if I tried to return to the deep places. The Dwemer do not threaten, they simply make consequences clear. I have been back to the surface since then. I have walked under the sun, breathed air not filtered through Dwemer systems, spoken with people who still laugh and weep and rage. The surface world feels increasingly unreal after time in the deep places, increasingly fragile, like a soap bubble floating above machinery designed to pop it. The Nords throw their festivals, the Bretons conduct their politics, the Imperials manage their bureaucracy. All of them use Dwemer technology, depend on Dwemer infrastructure, send their children to Dwemer-designed schools. All of them are being slowly, gently, kindly absorbed into something that will not hurt them, will not kill them, will simply make them irrelevant. I met a bard in Solitude who still sings the old songs. Songs about heroes who defied gods, about warriors who chose death over dishonor, about lovers who burned bright and brief, rather than long and dim. The younger people listen politely, applaud politely, and return to their Dwemer-optimized lives. The older people listen and weep, though they cannot always say why. The bard told me she is the last of her kind. No one is learning the old songs anymore. Why memorize stories when you can access any story ever written through Dwemer database terminals? Why spend years mastering an instrument when Dwemer sound synthesis can produce any music you want at perfect quality? She said she sings because someone has to remember what we were before we optimized ourselves out of existence. She said the Dwemer are winning not through force, but through being right. Their way is better by every objective measure. But she believes, and I believe, that there are some things that should not be measured. We drank together that night, that bard and I, and we sang songs the Dwemer will never understand. Songs about loss and longing and the terrible beauty of mortality. Songs about being imperfect and alive rather than perfect and empty. In the morning, she was gone, left Solitude, her friends told me, gone east to wander and sing for whoever will listen, fighting her war the only way she can, by keeping alive something that cannot be calculated. I think about her often. I think about all the people in this timeline who resist in small ways, who hold on to something the Dwemer cannot optimize away, but I also know they are fighting a losing battle. Each generation has less to remember. The year the Dwemer way seems more natural, more obviously correct. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers why the old ways mattered, and then the Dwemer will have won completely. They will have created a world of perfect logic, perfect efficiency, perfect emptiness. I watch them walking through their cities, those amber-goggled architects of their own extinction, and I understand finally what Kagrenac achieved that day beneath Red Mountain. He did not make his people immortal, he made them eternal, locked them into an existence where they cannot die, but also cannot live, where they persist forever, getting better at being what they are, never questioning whether what they are is worth being. They tried to become gods and succeeded only in becoming machines, but machines that will run forever, grinding everything else into parts, optimizing the world into silence. The war came anyway, not the war the Nords expected, not the war the Dwemer planned for, a different war, against an enemy their calculations had not predicted, because you cannot calculate hunger that existed before calculation itself. Alduin returned. I was in Blackreach when the first reports came through the Dwemer communication network. Dragons sighted across Skyrim. Not the semi-intelligent beasts the ancient Nords fought, but true dragons, speaking with voices that bent reality, burning entire settlements with breath that was not simply fire, but the concept of ending made manifest. The Dwemer response was immediate and efficient. They deployed aerial defense automatons. They activated tonal dampening fields designed to interfere with draconic Thu'um. They calculated optimal engagement strategies based on every recorded dragon encounter from the Merethic era. They approached the dragon crisis as they approached everything else, as a problem requiring technical solution. The dragons laughed. I heard it myself, standing in Whiterun as a blood dragon descended on the city. The Dwemer, security systems activated perfectly. Shock spheres rose to engage. Ballista emplacements tracked the dragon's flight path. Tonal disruptors broadcast frequencies meant to disrupt draconic shouts. Everything worked exactly as designed. The dragon ignored it all, not because the Dwemer weapons were ineffective, but because the dragon simply decided they did not matter. It spoke a word, a single word in a language older than mortality, and reality twisted. The automatons fell from the sky, their enchantments unraveled by something that existed before enchantments were possible. The tonal disruptors shattered, unable to disrupt something that was itself a fundamental tone of creation. Then, the dragon spoke again, and fire washed over the Dwemer installations like the end of things. The Dwemer did not panic. Panic is inefficient. They analyzed, they adapted, they calculated new strategies, accounting for the observed draconic abilities. They deployed heavier weapons, more sophisticated countermeasures. They began construction on dragon-specific deterrent systems, and the dragons kept coming, and kept laughing, and kept burning, because the Dwemer had made a fundamental error in their calculations. They had assumed that superior technology, superior understanding, superior optimization would allow them to overcome any challenge. They had forgotten, or perhaps never known, that there are forces in the world that do not care about your understanding, forces that exist outside the systems you have built, forces that recognize your precision as the perfect joke it is. Alduin himself came to Blackreach. I was there. I saw him descend into that impossibly vast cavern, saw him fold his wings and regard the Dwemer cities with eyes that had seen the beginning and would see the ending. He was vast beyond measurement, black scales that seemed to drink light, and when he spoke, his voice made the stones themselves resonate with dread. The Dwemer met him with Numidium. They activated the brass god for the first time in centuries. That 1,000-foot construct of brass and blasphemy rose from its chamber in the deepest part of Blackreach, and the sound of its movement was like continents grinding together. The Dwemer had prepared for this. They had contingencies. They had calculated that if divine entities became problematic, they possessed the means to combat divinity itself. Numidium stood before Alduin, and for a moment I thought the Dwemer would win. The brass tower had unmade gods before. It was a weapon of such fundamental wrongness that reality itself flinched from it. Against any other threat, it would have been sufficient, but Alduin is not any other threat. Alduin is the World-Eater. His purpose is not to exist within the world, but to end it, to return it to the drawing board so the next world can begin. He does not fight according to the rules of reality, because he is the mechanism that rewrites those rules. And when he looked upon Numidium, upon the Dwemer's greatest achievement, he understood what they had built better than they understood it themselves. He laughed. The sound was not mockery, it was recognition. Alduin spoke to Numidium in a voice that shook the foundations of Blackreach. He said, "You are well made, little denial engine. You deny the world very efficiently, but you are still part of what you deny. You exist only because the world exists to be refused. I am the end of worlds. When I consume this one, I will consume you with it, and your refusal will mean nothing because there will be nothing left to refuse." Then he demonstrated. Alduin did not fight Numidium. He did not need to. He simply began to eat the world around it. His Thu'um was not destruction magic scaled up. It was literal consumption, reality being devoured and digested and unmade. The brass tower stood firm, its denial field protecting it from the immediate effect, but everything around it began to dissolve into temporal chaos. I watched Dwemer cities come unbuilt before my eyes, watched brass towers flow backward through their construction, watched the carefully carved stones return to uncut rock, watched the glowing mushroom farms revert to spores and then to nothing. Time itself was being eaten, and Numidium could only protect itself, not the civilization that built it. The Dwemer tried to fight. They deployed everything they had, weapons that manipulated fundamental forces, devices that froze time locally, constructs powered by Ethereum and shaped by tonal architecture to be unkillable, and Alduin ate them all, not by destroying them but by unhappening them, by consuming the timeline in which they existed. It was then that I understood what the Dwemer had never understood. They had achieved perfection within the system. They had optimized themselves to the absolute peak of what was possible for mortal beings operating in consensus reality. But Alduin existed outside that system. He was not more powerful than Numidium. He was playing a different game entirely, and the Dwemer did not know the rules. Numidium stood alone in an expanding sphere of consumed reality, and even the brass tower's perfect denial began to crack under the weight of being the only thing left that insisted it existed. Then, something unexpected happened. A Nord appeared. Not a hero, not a legendary figure, just a Nord, a young woman who had been in Blackreach on a trading run when Alduin attacked. She carried an iron sword and wore leather armor, and had no business being anywhere near a battle between a god machine and the World-Eater. But she shouted. Her Thu'um was not sophisticated. She had learned a few words of power, the way many Nords do, knowing them as cultural heritage rather than weapons. Her shout was unrefined, inefficient, wasteful of energy. By Dwemer standards, it was laughably suboptimal, but it worked, because her shout was not calculated, it was not optimized. It was raw, expression of will, of the fundamental mortal audacity that says I exist and I matter even when confronting forces that could erase me. Her shout was everything the Dwemer had engineered out of themselves, imperfect, passionate, because her shout was not calculated, it was not optimized. It was raw expression of will, of the fundamental mortal audacity that says I exist and I matter even when confronting forces that could erase me. Her shout was everything the Dwemer had engineered out of themselves, imperfect, passionate, alive. Alduin paused, not because her shout hurt him. One mortal's Thu'um could not harm the World-Eater, but because it reminded him of something he had forgotten in his eons of existence. Mortals were not meant to be perfected. They were meant to be mortals, flawed and brief, and burning bright precisely because they knew their time was limited. The Dwemer had tried to remove that limitation, and in doing so, had made themselves less than mortal. They had become permanent fixtures, eternal mechanisms, and Alduin could simply wait them out. They would exist forever, unchanging, and therefore they were already dead in every way that mattered. But this Nord woman would die, soon, probably, within decades at most. And because she knew this, every moment she lived was an act of defiance against the ending that awaited her. She was what mortals were meant to be. Alduin looked at her, and then he looked at Numidium, and then he departed. He did not fly away. He simply chose to be elsewhere, because time meant nothing to him, and he could return to end this world whenever he wished. The Dwemer had bought themselves nothing but delay. The woman collapsed after he left. The effort of her shout, combined with the terror of standing before the World-Eater, had drained her completely. I ran to her, helped her to her feet, asked her name. She said her name was Lisbeth. She had a farm near Rorikstead. She came to Blackreach once a month to sell crops to the Dwemer because they paid well and her family needed the coin. She did not know why she had shouted. It seemed like the thing to do. I asked her if she understood what she had done. She looked at me confused and said she had not done anything. The dragon had simply left. She assumed it had gotten bored. I did not correct her. Some people are heroes without knowing it, and perhaps that is the purest kind of heroism. The Dwemer analyzed the encounter extensively. They studied recordings from every sensor, measured every variable, calculated probabilities, and alternative outcomes. Their conclusion was that Alduin had departed because his cost-benefit analysis of consuming Blackreach at that moment did not favor immediate action. They determined that increased defensive measures would be sufficient to deter future draconic incursions. They did not understand that Alduin had not been deterred. He had been reminded, and reminders, unlike calculations, cannot be predicted or defended against. The dragon attacks continued across Skyrim. The Dwemer adapted their tactics, achieved better engagement ratios, reduced casualty rates in defended zones. By their metrics, they were winning. But the dragons were not fighting a war the Dwemer could win. They were fighting a war the Dwemer could not even recognize. Dragons did not want territory. They did not want resources. They wanted dominion, the acknowledgement that they were greater, that their voices could reshape reality, and mortal voices could not. The Dwemer refused to acknowledge this. They treated dragons as hostile fauna, requiring management, categorizing them by size and breath weapon type, and optimal counter strategies. The dragons found this insulting in a way that made them more dangerous. An enemy who fears you can be negotiated with. An enemy who respects you can be reasoned with. But an enemy who reduces you to data points in an optimization algorithm cannot be reached by any means other than demonstrating that you exist outside their systems. So the dragons began targeting Dwemer cities specifically, not the surface cities where the Dwemer had influence, but their underground strongholds, the deep places where they believed themselves safe. Dragons are ancient, and the ancient remember paths that the young have forgotten. They knew ways into the deep places, and they took them. I watched a dragon called Vienturuth descend through a great lift shaft into Mzinchileft. The Dwemer sealed blast doors behind it, activated every defense system in that sector, prepared to contain and eliminate the threat according to established protocols. Vienturuth spoke a word, and the blast doors aged 1,000 years in seconds, crumbling to rust. It spoke another word, and the defense systems remembered being ore in the ground before they were forged. It flew through the halls of Mzinchileft, speaking the world backward, and the Dwemer fled before it, not out of fear, but out of calculation. That survival required tactical retreat. But where could they retreat to? The surface, where they had not truly lived in centuries, to other deep cities, where other dragons were already attacking, to Numidium, which could protect itself but not them. For the first time since Red Mountain, the Dwemer faced a problem they could not engineer away. They could survive the dragons, individually and collectively, but only by abandoning the civilization they had built, only by becoming refugees in a world they had spent centuries trying to perfect. Some chose to evacuate to the surface, bringing what equipment they could carry, seeking shelter in the cities their automatons had kept peaceful. The surface dwellers took them in, though the dynamic had shifted. The Dwemer were no longer benefactors, sharing their superior technology. They were survivors requiring assistance. I saw Dwemer in solitude, wearing their amber goggles and looking lost. They had lived their entire lives underground, in controlled environments, breathing filtered air and eating optimized nutrition. The sun hurt their eyes even through the amber lenses. The wind confused them because it was unpredictable. The smell of the sea made them uncomfortable because they could not categorize it properly. They were strangers in the world they had tried to improve, and the world did not know what to do with them. Others retreated deeper. If the dragons could reach the upper levels, the Dwemer would go lower, dig further, build in places even dragons could not access. They would wait out the crisis, the way they waited out everything, with patience that came from having removed death as a limiting factor. And some, a very few, did something the Dwemer had not done in living memory. They gave up. I met one in the ruins of Nchardak on Solstheim. He had removed his amber goggles, and his eyes were damaged, scarred by seeing wavelengths mortal eyes were not meant to perceive. He could barely see me, but he knew I was there. He spoke in a voice that sounded unused to speaking, said he had been a tonal architect for 200 years, said he had helped design systems that should have made the Dwemer invulnerable to any threat, said he finally understood that invulnerability was not the same as being alive. He asked me if I thought there was any way back, any way for the Dwemer to remember how to be mortal, how to be imperfect, how to fail and hurt and die and accept these things as part of existence rather than problems to be solved. I told him the truth. I did not know. The Dwemer had gone so far down their chosen path that I could not see how they might turn around. You cannot unoptimize yourself once you have forgotten what you sacrificed to achieve optimization. He nodded, thanked me, and walked into the sea. His body was never found. The Dwemer recorded him as a casualty of the Dragon Crisis, filed his death in their databases, and assigned his research projects to other architects. They did not mourn him because mourning is inefficient. They simply continued. But I mourned him. I mourned all of them, the living and the dead, the ones who kept working and the ones who gave up. I mourned what they could have been if they had failed at Red Mountain, if Kagrenac's great work had destroyed them in an instant, rather than preserving them for this slow, cold extinction. The war with the dragons continues. It will continue for years, perhaps decades. The Dwemer will adapt, survive, persist. They are very good at persisting, and eventually, whether through dragon fire or simple attrition, whether through calculated decision or final desperation, they will activate Numidium at full power. They will use the brass tower for its intended purpose, not as defense, but as the ultimate expression of their philosophy. Total denial, total refusal, the elimination of everything that will not submit to their understanding, and perhaps that will stop the dragons. Perhaps the World-Eater himself will find that even his hunger cannot consume a race that has already consumed itself from within, that has become so perfectly nothing that there is nothing left to end. Or perhaps Alduin will eat them anyway, and their perfection will mean nothing in the face of the one force that does not care about your calculations. I cannot stay to see which future unfolds. The displacement that brought me here is becoming unstable. I feel it in my bones, in the way reality shivers around me at odd moments. Soon I will snap back to my own timeline, to a world where the Dwemer vanished and left only mysteries, only ruins, only questions, and I will be grateful, because I have seen what happens when you get all the answers. I have seen what happens when you optimize the mystery out of existence. I have seen the Dwemer Renaissance, and it is the saddest thing I have ever witnessed. An entire race that achieved everything it wanted and discovered that achievement without joy is just another form of death. They never disappeared in this timeline. They never vanished, and that is Tamriel's greatest tragedy, because disappearing would have been mercy. Vanishing would have been an ending, and endings allow for new beginnings. Instead, they remain, perfected and permanent and hollow, machines wearing the skin of elves, walking through cities they built to last forever, having forgotten why forever might not be worth pursuing. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left closed. The Dwemer tried to become gods and succeeded only in becoming machines. And machines, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how eternal, can never understand the one thing that makes life worth living, the knowledge that it ends. That is my confession. That is my warning. I have seen the world where the Dwemer did not disappear, and I tell you now with absolute certainty, their disappearance was the kindest thing that ever happened to them, whatever ending they found. Whatever fate Kagrenac's tools brought down upon them, it was more merciful than the alternative. Be grateful for mysteries. Be grateful for things you cannot explain. Be grateful for failure and death and all the imperfections that make you mortal, because the alternative is not divinity. The alternative is being a Dwemer, eternal and empty, walking through forever without ever truly living. I see the displacement beginning now, reality fragmenting at the edges of my vision. Soon I will return to my timeline, to ruins that hold only echoes, to a vanished people that left only questions, and I will be grateful for those ruins, grateful for those questions, grateful that the Dwemer are gone and cannot build their perfect, terrible future in my world. Alduin laughs somewhere in the sky above me. He knows what I know now. He knows that some endings are gifts, and some victories are defeats wearing the wrong name. He knows that when he finally comes to end this world, the Dwemer will resist with all their terrible perfection, and it will not matter, because you cannot calculate destiny. You cannot optimize your way out of being mortal. You cannot become so perfect that the ending forgets your name. The Dwemer tried. They are still trying. They will keep trying until there is nothing left of them but the trying itself, purpose without person, function without soul. And when the World-Eater finally comes for them, when Alduin decides their delay has ended and their calculations are complete, he will consume their perfect cities and their perfect machines and their perfect empty lives. And reality will close over the space where they were like water over a stone, and the world will continue, and no one will remember that perfection was ever there except me. I will remember. And this recording, this confession, this warning will survive however it survives, will reach whoever it reaches. And maybe someone will listen. Maybe someone will hear what I am saying between the words. Do not seek perfection. Do not try to eliminate mystery. Do not optimize yourself out of being human. The Dwemer Renaissance happened, and it was the death of everything that made them worth knowing. Some prices are paid in what you become, not what you give up, and the Dwemer paid everything they were for the privilege of existing forever as something less. I am going home now, back to a world where the Dwemer are gone, back to ruins that hold questions instead of answers, back to a timeline where Kagrenac's great work destroyed his people in an instant rather than preserving them for this slow extinction. And I will never, ever wish that they had succeeded.